Okay, so we are now recording, and with that, we'll begin this first of the Next System speakers for 2022, and I should actually say the first of any Next System speakers series here at Mason or at any other institution, because this is the first Next System Studies program that has been initiated in academia. I want to welcome all of you to this event tonight. Really looking forward to this discussion. I said tonight because there was actually a team of us who are mostly represented here who were up until midnight working on a grant proposal. So we're operating on that kind of timeline with Next System Studies. My name is Ben Manske. I am an assistant professor of sociology at Mason, mostly operating off of the Fairfax campus, together with my colleague John Dale, who's an associate professor in sociology. We have been working to build the Next System Fellows, which is a new cohort of the Arlington Fellows program here at Mason. We're joined here today by fellows from other Arlington Fellows programs and also colleagues on the faculty at Mason. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. And we're also joined by, it looks like a fair number of people online on Zoom and recording this for others who are not able to join us at this time. So again, thanks for joining us and for coming out today. I'm really looking forward to the talk and the discussion. Immediately to my left and to your right is Joe Guinan, who has served in a number of roles at the Democracy Collaborative, among them as executive director of the Next System Project, and now vice president at the Democracy Collaborative, which is a strategy center and think tank with offices in Washington, D.C. We'll be hearing a lot about their work today. I think we've known each other for maybe 6 or 7 years since the launch of some of these initiatives. It's been really wonderful to have the opportunity to take work that originated at an institution of higher education at the University of Maryland, actually many years ago, 20 years ago, when Garl Perovitz and Ted Howard were setting up the Democracy Collaborative back then. And then has moved into civil society on a transnational level, which Joe Guinan has been sort of instrumental in building, and then to come back into academia to find ways for institutions like this one to intervene in helping civil society to transition to a system that delivers on the goals that I think are universally shared. Goals of creating society that's truly democratic, that's sustainable, that can sustain life on this biosphere, that is equitable, and I won't take any more away from your talk.
Stealing my lines.
I'm really very pleased that Joe Guinan is inaugurating this, and please give him a warm welcome today.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you very much for having me here today at George Mason University. It's a real honor to be here to inaugurate these Next System lectures amidst all the important work that you're doing with the Next System Fellows program, for which I salute you. You're a breath of fresh air in otherwise dark times, and I'm really looking forward to a period of collaboration between us at the Democracy Collaborative and all of you. I realized when I was preparing for this conversation that in choosing this title with Ben, The Political Economy of the Next System, I'd inadvertently agreed to attempting to offer what amounts to my unified theory of everything. And please bear with me then while I attempt that heavy lift. I want to start by acknowledging that we're taking up these weighty themes in what are actually very difficult times, geopolitically, personally, psychologically even. Unfortunately, we now have to add another war to the catalog of conflict all around the world. The pandemic still rages. Inflation is looming, and with it, a new era of economic and political struggle over who will bear the costs of this failing economic system. And of course, racial injustice, even if it's increasingly acknowledged, doesn't burn any less painfully. So I want to stand in solidarity with all of you in these difficult times as we take up what I'm going to argue today is the central issue facing us all, whether we like it or not. And that is the systemic nature of the crisis that we are facing and the need for systemic solutions in response. So one thing that the generally dismal situation means, I think, is that I probably don't need to spend a huge amount of time arguing that we face a systemic crisis. That was a very different story 7 years ago when we first launched our Next System project. Back in March 2015, as Ben mentioned, we launched the Next System project with a statement that was signed by hundreds of leading scholars, activists, and practitioners called "It's time to face the depth of the systemic crisis we confront." And we wrote an accompanying prospectus, New Political Economic Possibilities for the 21st Century, which went with that. When we launched that project, this contention, this idea that we are facing a crisis of the system, not just local political or economic difficulties, was a bold and provocative one. But I'd argue it's one that's now increasingly widely accepted, even in the halls of power, both domestically and internationally. This is an argument we are increasingly winning. Let me give you an example. In our first day message to the staff at the Department of the US Treasury, Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, spoke of 4 historic crises facing the United States. And this is Yellen. COVID-19 is one, but in addition to the pandemic, the country is also facing a climate crisis, a crisis of systemic racism, and an economic crisis that has been building for 50 years. Now, 10 years ago, it would have been almost unheard of to hear such words from such a high-ranking economic official in the United States. Today, it's commonplace. The Treasury Secretary is not alone in the use of such language, which we can increasingly find in US government communiques, even in pronouncements of international institutions like the IMF or the OECD. It's a sign of important progress that the profoundly systemic nature of the crisis has finally begun to dawn, even on high-ranking officialdom. And in that respect, at least, the real and present dangers of the Trump era have had their effects. And yet, what I'm going to argue today is based on the belief, the understanding, that a dangerous gulf still remains between the magnitude of that systemic crisis and the scope and scale of the responses that are being conceived and proposed. And this is a gulf from which, if we're not careful, new monsters may soon begin to appear. While I think it's fair to say that the first year of the Biden administration may have been more promising than many might have expected in terms of the actions that they proved willing to entertain, it's already run into the sand of our political gridlock. We don't even have to watch the State of the Union address tonight to know that we're still stuck. But, and I think this is where it starts to get really tough, I'd argue that even if it had gone ahead full steam, if Congress had been prepared and willing to pass the Build Back Better Act and move on a raft of other positive legislative initiatives, we shouldn't delude ourselves that this kind of modest liberal reform agenda, while it may do many good things, is anything like the level and depth of intervention that's actually necessary to bend the curve on what are actually long-run negative trends that we're facing. Let me emphasize that. Under Democrat and Republican alike, in economic so-called good times and bad, the outcomes of this system for most Americans have been getting steadily worse in real terms. We've produced something at the Democracy Collaborative we call the Index of Systemic Trends, so you don't need to just believe me. One of the signs that a crisis is systemic rather than purely political or economic is that key indicators decline or stay the same, regardless of changes in political power or business cycles. Now, since 1970, the US has experienced 7 party changes in the White House, 6 party changes in control of the Senate, 4 in the House of Representatives. It's also experienced 7 recessions and recoveries. And yet, as our index demonstrates, on many very important indicators of economic, social, and democratic health, there's been little improvement, and in many cases, substantial deterioration over this period since the 1970s. The trends we considered include poverty, wealth inequality, racial wealth inequality, income inequality, wage stagnation, the cost of higher education, student loan debt, home ownership and the racial aspects of that, corporate taxation, taxation of the rich, union density, incarceration rates, including by race, labor force participation rates, healthcare costs, climate change, and life expectancy. It's by no means a comprehensive or empirical study. It's designed purely to be illustrative of what we believe is an important observation, that the current political economic system is consistently failing to deliver improvement especially compared to other advanced economies across a variety of different measures, and that this is indicative of a systemic crisis and the need to move in the direction of a new system that can and will produce better outcomes. We're hoping to bring out future editions that update those trends and comparisons for COVID in recent years, as well as add new ones that can help provide a broader picture. We're also hoping to be able to include potentially positive trends in the direction of a new system. All of this then points to the deeply systemic nature of the problem. And as I said, this is relatively uncontroversial. The problem we face is not in diagnosing systemic crisis, but in proposing systemic solutions. So let's try a thought experiment based on Janet Yellen's 4 crises. What would a systemic response even look like? In analytical terms, we might look to identify some hard constraints of these overlapping crises, such that we begin to see a landing zone for effective remedial and transformative action, and one that can be articulated as part of boosting the level of the ambition of our responses. And in very broad brush terms, it should be possible to delineate and perhaps even model the magnitude of the required transition we're talking about. So leaving aside COVID, which we can come back to and talk about in the discussion if you like, it actually is the biggest peacetime economic shock in recorded capitalist history, but it's one which has largely accelerated the negative trends we've been talking about rather than changing them in any substantial way. But beyond COVID looms that other longer run triple crisis: economic inequality, environmental collapse due to climate change, and racial injustice. And this brings with it a very severe challenge if we're to strike simultaneously on all 3 of these together. Let's start with the racial wealth gap in the United States. It's estimated at around $10 trillion. That's wealth that has been extracted and stolen from and denied to communities of color. And it's equivalent to around half of annual US gross domestic product. Now, at the same time, we're also facing an environmental structural problem. We're consuming currently at a rate of throughput that is beyond regeneration, equivalent to 1.5 planet Earths. To get back within those planetary boundaries and avert climate collapse, even with technology and green growth in some sectors, we're inevitably going to have to face up to major cutbacks in consumption or degrowth of some kind, however unpalatable that may be. So you see how difficult we've got to address in reparative terms that historical inequity that amounts to half of the existing economy on an annual basis, at the same time as we shrink consumption overall. Then we have to layer in the rest of the problem. Meanwhile, economic inequality and stagnant median wages and living standards for so many pose a really stark challenge, and we see this over and over again in building a majoritarian political coalition that's both redistributive and pre-distributive without relying on growth and at the same time delivering reparative justice. And at the same time avoiding the pitfalls of reactionary politics, racialized division, and those instincts to pull up the ladder that we see from semi-privileged groups. So at the intersection of these 3 challenges, there's a wicked problem in political economy terms. The landing zone for accomplishing all of this all at once is by definition pretty narrow and circumscribed. It's certainly not a world that contains trillionaires, which is the latest grim prospect that has emerged from the COVID period. It will likely require a shift in the ownership and control of capital that dwarfs even such radical episodes in history as the Industrial Revolution itself, or the upheavals that we saw in the 20th century. And of course, we'll be seeking to do so peaceably and on the basis of a rebuilding and reconstruction of community and democratic public life. So given all that, only certain pathways forward are going to deliver the fundamental changes in outcomes that are necessary. And these then must become the de facto contours of a possible, practical, desirable next system, one that doesn't rely on correcting antisocial externalities after the fact through taxation and regulation, but is capable in and of itself of producing the desirable outcomes, economic, environmental, social, and political, that we want and need as a result of its everyday operations. I would argue what that amounts to is that we need a democratic economy in support of a democratic politics. There'll also be a challenge around this, as we've seen from the climate change debate, and framing what are really some pretty hard constraints in that regard in a manner that's actually expansive rather than restrictive of future potentialities and possibilities. Developing the politics and strategy that can pull that off is the fundamental epochal challenge of our age and has got to become the central mission of transformative political action in the years ahead. But that's my conclusion. Before we get there, we need to unpack a little bit what a system is and what system change in political economic terms actually means. So let's start with the centrality of ownership. At the Democracy Collaborative, when we think of systems, at the heart of our approach is a recognition of the centrality of ownership. Who owns and controls capital, productive wealth? It's the age-old, most fundamental question of political economy, going back to Smith and Marx, central to understanding the operations of any economic system. We can look at economic systems in history, and we'll see that they're largely defined by the way that property is owned and controlled, particularly productive economic property. So in feudalism, that was a political economic structure that was based overall around who controlled productive land. It was the lords, the church, the king. It was not the peasants. 19th century free enterprise capitalism was largely structured around small, medium scale, competitive, entrepreneurial capitalist ownership. Various forms of corporate capitalism, including, I'd argue, the one that we have today. There was the fairly pure corporate domination of the late 19th and early 20th century, trends to which we might actually now be returning. But there was also the managed corporate capitalism, which was capitalism balanced by labor, of a kind that we've seen in many European nations. And also, to a much lesser degree, that was the system that was operating in the United States from 1945 until about 1980. There's also fascism, corporate capitalism managed by authoritarian rule of the kind that existed in Germany, Italy, and Spain in the 30s and 40s, and in different forms among some Latin American dictatorships. And unfortunately, fascism has made its reappearance on the global stage as a contender, which we need to grapple with. So what system are we in at the moment? Today, a mere 400 individuals in the United States now own more wealth than the bottom 2/3 of Americans taken together. This is a feature, not a bug, of the current system design. What we're seeing is deepening problems, wage stagnation, underinvestment, low productivity, those widening inequalities of wealth and power, climate danger, that are not simply accidental or the result of poor policy choices that are being made, but they are the entirely predictable outcomes of the basic organization of the economy. Look at the institutional arrangements at the heart of today's capitalism. Private ownership, credit creation by banks, global capital markets, giant publicly traded corporations. What these form together is the most powerful engine for the extraction of value that the world has ever known. It's this set of relationships, this basic institutional design, that drives all those outcomes that we're seeing in terms of crumbling public infrastructure, social atomization, uneven development, environmental destruction, and a widespread sense of popular disempowerment in our politics. A political economy is a system, and this system is programmed not to meet basic needs, but to steadily concentrate virtually all the gains to the economy in the hands of a tiny elite. And so it follows that if we're actually serious about addressing real economic challenges, then we need a different set of institutions and arrangements that are capable of producing sustainable, lasting, more democratic outcomes. A new paradigm, that democratic economy in support of a democratic polity I talked about. Now, it's our contention at the collaborative that elements of this new direction are already emerging all around the world in a series of potentially powerful models. These include state-owned banks, municipally owned utilities, worker-owned firms, community-owned solar, many other practical efforts that are rooted in this core value of community. These institutional designs model some of the fundamentals of a potential next system, a democratic, community-sustaining political economy that operates within planetary boundaries where all can thrive and where we take back our power from the grip of the casino economy that's on autopilot at the moment. So let's try and make that a bit more real, a bit less abstract. Let's make it a tale of two economies. Imagine with me, if you will, two economies. Let's call the first one the extractive economy. What does it look like? Well, overall, the extractive economy is ruled by capital. It's one in which finance has colonized the economy, politics, society, and the planet itself. And a number of consequences flow from this. First is the subordinate position of labor and work. Unlike profits, the returns to capital, which are to be maximized, returns to labor are seen as an input into production, a cost to be minimized or even eliminated. Ownership of capital in this economy might seem obscure and atomized, but if you pull back the curtain, it's actually extremely concentrated and financialized. In this economy, place is subordinate to markets, which are disembodied and global. Particular places are seen largely as to whether they are better or worse sites for extraction. There's no real community in this economy because we're told that there's no such thing as society, only individuals and families maximizing their own welfare. The planet, too, is subordinate to this economy, viewed as a limitless source of extraction, a limitless sink for waste. In this economy, it's claimed that free markets will self-regulate and result in freedom for all. But what this actually translates into in practice is freedom for capital and unfreedom for everyone else. Government in this economy is denigrated in theory, but in practice, it's captured by narrow interests and works for their benefit. This economy then is one of deep structural power imbalances that create seemingly neutral decisions that in fact serve a very narrow elite. And we don't actually have to imagine this economy. This is today's economy. This is the economy we live in, the extractive economy. Corporate power dominates government decision-making through lobbying and political contributions. Income and wealth inequality is increasing dramatically. Available jobs are ever more precarious. This is an economy of monopoly power, with a few big banks, energy companies, and retailers dominating their sectors, able to rip off both customers and suppliers with impunity. Everywhere in this economy, wealth and power flow not downwards to consumers and ordinary citizens, but upwards to economic elites. And the rulers of this economy make their money not by producing goods and services that are useful to others, but through their ownership and control of assets. Landlords and property developers control land. Energy companies control natural resources. Banks control the money supply. This economy is built around the battle to control assets rather than the creation of new wealth. It's about extracting wealth from other people in the economy through sky-high rents, rip-off energy bills, usurious bank charges, or even share buybacks. The same logic applies to the unsustainable extraction of natural resources, which is pushing us ever closer towards ecological disaster. So let's imagine another economy instead. This one instead would be a moral economy, a democratic economy. Finance in such an economy would be put back in service of people, communities, and the planet. In this economy, labor comes before capital. Good, decent work is a core social aim and source of individual development. Ownership is not concentrated, but broadly based and widely shared. And stewardship is the basis of ownership, not exploitation. This is a real and not a financialized economy. All economic activity in this economy occurs in real places, and communities are able to take control of their own destinies. It's a collaborative economy in which human flourishing occurs in healthy communities and a livable planet. The economy recognizes that we have only one planet on which all life is interdependent, and real ecological boundaries require limits to growth. Human development is the real face of freedom in this economy, requiring removal of unfreedoms, such as poverty and the lack of opportunity. Government plays a big role in this economy, but in a democratic and decentralized fashion. It's recognized that our collective ability to govern ourselves is the bedrock of the good society, and the institutions of this democratic economy are consciously designed and controlled to serve the common good. It's a little harder to imagine, isn't it? Perhaps because we've forgotten how to hope and how to demand. We've become somewhat impoverished in our imaginations. And as a result, it's harder to imagine an economy in which, when we wake up each day and we look out the window, we could know that in and of itself, that economy would produce better outcomes, greater equality, more democracy, healthier people and communities, a cleaner environment. It's hard to imagine, but it's not impossible. And more people are doing it. And this is the good news that I'm bringing. So yes, the world's on fire. Yes, millions are living in economic anxiety. Yes, we're losing animal and plant species every day to the sixth great era of extinction. Yes, we've only got 60 harvests left globally, given the depletion of the soils. Yes, a handful of billionaires, soon to be trillionaires, own as much wealth as the rest of us put together. Yes, all this is true. But at the same time, there's also a new democratic economy in the making, another future. And in fact, that future is already here. It's just not yet evenly distributed. And that's the most exciting thing to me about the democratic economy. It's not some pipe dream, but the fact that it's already emerging all around, a spontaneous response to social pain by people in some of our poorest communities. Traditional policies and approaches have demonstrably failed them, and as a consequence, more and more people are beginning to turn to genuine economic alternatives in which new wealth is built collectively and from the bottom up. And recent years have witnessed an explosion of interest in and practical experimentation with a variety of alternative economic institutions and models that are capable of fundamentally altering patterns of ownership and of producing greatly improved economic, environmental, and social outcomes. These alternative economic institutions include worker ownership, cooperatives, municipal enterprise, community land trusts, public banks, benefit corporations, social wealth funds, and more. They represent ways in which capital can be democratized and held in common by workers, communities, local governments, and others. They illuminate how practical new approaches can generate innovative solutions to these deep underlying trends. They embody alternative design principles, relying not on regulatory fixes or after-the-fact redistribution, but on deep structural changes in the economy itself and the nature of ownership and control over wealth that go right to the heart of our current difficulties. And new forms are constantly emerging, as well as ideas as to how innovative combinations might produce still more powerful results. They suggest the contours of a next system beyond the extractive economy and some pathways for getting there. At the Democracy Collaborative, we and our allies call these approaches and institutions and the strategies for knitting them together community wealth building. And I wanted to spend the last of my remarks around community wealth building as the pathway to building the democratic economy and how everyone can start to do it in their own communities. Community wealth building is now emerging far and wide as a new model of economic development. It offers on-the-ground solutions to localities that have been battered by successive waves of disinvestment, deindustrialization, or on the other hand, displacement and disempowerment in hot markets. It's based on a new configuration of economic institutions, like I've been talking about, that in and of themselves produce more sustainable, lasting, and equal local economic outcomes. It's rooted in place-based economics, democratic participation and control, and mobilizing the largely untapped power of the local public and nonprofit sector. So let me give you a couple of examples of community wealth building in action. The original model of community wealth building is the Evergreen Co-ops in Cleveland, Ohio. We created Evergreen in response to the devastation that that city had faced after years of trade liberalization and capital flight, the story that's common across the Rust Belt. What we found when we looked at Cleveland, though, was that despite the flight of Fortune 500 companies and massive loss of population, what was still left behind were these large anchor institutions, as we call them. This is the Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve University. It's also university hospitals. And if you put them together, between them, there was about $3 billion a year in goods and services that they were procuring, very, very little of which was procured from the local community. So at the collaborative, we worked with the anchors, with the city, and with the Cleveland Foundation to really produce a strategy that was about localization of procurement in support of a network of purposely created green worker co-ops, the Evergreen Co-ops, which are tied together in a community corporation. These include an industrial scale ecologically advanced laundry, a large urban greenhouse, and a renewable energy company. We've recently added a fund to pursue employee ownership conversions of existing businesses. They're linked by a community serving nonprofit corporation and a revolving fund. which means that the evergreen companies cannot easily be sold outside of their network, and they return a percentage of their profits to develop additional worker-owned firms and grow the local economy. Unlike conventional corporations, these democratic businesses will not pick up and move their jobs to another location because the community owns a golden share. So they won't be sold off to private equity to enrich only the current generation of worker owners and pull up the ladder beneath them, which is often a problem with cooperatives. They provide living wage jobs for their worker owners who also receive a share of the profits. They also begin to show how we can keep money recirculating locally rather than extracting it. The estimate of the multiplier effect from buying local is 8, which means that if you buy from a large multinational, the dollar immediately leaves your community. Whereas if you buy from a local business, it stays local and it's spent locally a further 8 times. And through such strategies, which are the very opposite of the extraction that we were talking about earlier, money can be kept circulated, anchoring jobs, building community wealth, reversing long-term economic decline. Evergreen's been a real success story. The companies are profitable. They're now competing with the multinational corporations that previously provided the contract services to the big anchor institutions. Not long ago, the Evergreen Laundry beat out the multinational firm Sodexo for 100% of the Cleveland Clinic's laundry contracts. Imagine just how much laundry a hospital is processing. So what Evergreen did was acquire the former Sodexo plants, hire all the former Sodexo workers, and gave them all a pay raise to the local living wage, and put them on a fast track to employee ownership within the firm. Not a single job was lost. All that changed was that the profits now circulate in Cleveland rather than going to distant absentee shareholders in Sodexo. Meanwhile, this approach has leaped across the Atlantic. The example of Cleveland caught the attention of a young Labour Party councillor, Matthew Brown, in the city of Preston in the northwest of England, which is about 15 miles from where I grew up, which is a similar sort of Rust Belt situation and been left high and dry by a conventional economic development approach. Preston then took up the Cleveland model and radically expanded it. And it now encompasses a string of public sector anchors across Preston and in the surrounding county of Lancashire, to which Matthew and his colleagues have added public pension investment, affordable housing, while laying the foundation for the development of a community bank in the area. Now, this was once a poster child for economic deprivation and left behind places. Preston was among the 20th most deprived places in the UK. What we're now seeing is significant payoffs already from community wealth building approaches. Preston's now been named the UK's most improved urban area. The share of the public procurement budget spent in the city went from 5% in 2013 to 18%, which was a gain of £75 million. But even more impressively, across Lancashire in the region, it rose from 39% to 79%. And what that meant was a gain of £200 million worth of economic activity in Lancashire. Unemployment's fallen. Preston has achieved above average improvements for health, transport, work-life balance, and youth and adult skills. Other places are now following the lead, and what we're doing at the moment is now re-importing this broader approach to community wealth building back into the United States. And we're seeing its uptake in a variety of places. We're working with Somerville, just outside Boston in Massachusetts. We're working with Meadville in Pennsylvania, with Alameda County in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And also the city of Chicago, excitingly, has taken up a pilot on community wealth building and is looking at how to develop a more comprehensive approach. We're now seeing these approaches adapted and implemented everywhere, whether it's New York City or the Pine Ridge Lakota Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, which is one of the poorest communities in the Western Hemisphere. And so what we're seeing with community wealth building is, if you like, the basis of this new democratic economy in the making. It's adaptable. The principles can be applied not in a one-size-fits-all blueprint approach, but locally, bottom-up, in co-production with communities and with local anchors. We're very excited to see that this is already beginning to take place here in Northern Virginia, and look forward to cooperating with you on your journey as you move forward. So let me just finish by saying, I think what we really need to do is rise to the challenge of this profoundly dangerous era that we're in, of pain and difficulty, by advancing this practicable alternative economics that's actually commensurate with the enormity of the task that we're facing, which is community stabilization and reconstruction. Prior to the 1930s, we saw an example of this in the key elements of what became the New Deal were developed in the state and local laboratories of democracy. The hard work was done to lay the ground both for new national institutions and programs, but also a new national politics, a progressive vision that at the time offered something to hope for, to work towards, and which could counter the traditional corporate power that had dominated the preceding decades. As the Great Depression got underway in the US after the Wall Street crash, the levels of economic pain and hardship grew, like in our own times. The prevailing ideology of that time was that the federal government shouldn't do anything to address the economic cataclysm that was unfolding. Instead, the market would be allowed to correct itself. And so in community after community, people were left with no alternative but to begin addressing their problems themselves. New approaches were devised that could then eventually be scaled up when a new political opening presented itself in due course. And so we got America's primary social safety net for the elderly, the social security system, which began with prototypes in Alaska and California as people grappled with the deep economic challenges they were confronting. Then, when politics changed nationally, when the Roosevelt administration came to power, it was possible to launch the New Deal. A similar thing happened in the UK. When Nye Bevan launched the National Health Service in 1948, he was able to draw for inspiration upon the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, a tiny community-based model in his hometown in South Wales, where workers had banded together in a friendly society to provide for themselves and their family medical aid beyond the bare facilities available. Begun in 1890, this little friendly society grew to serve the vast majority of the town's population. It encompassed the services of 5 general practitioners, a surgeon, 2 pharmacists, a dentist, a physiotherapist, a domiciliary nurse, all of these free at the point of use. So when the Attlee government came in and was elected in a landslide, and Bevan set about constructing the National Health Service, there was this small Welsh experiment that could serve as an exemplar and an inspiration for what will be possible at the national level in creating one of the world's great national health systems. So I mentioned these examples just so that we can get a sense of, if we plant the seeds today and the work that we're doing, however small it may seem against the tide of those big trends I was talking about, in many ways, it may well be the work of prefiguring what needs to happen overall at the systemic level when we can build towards the national level political opening that we need eventually to solve all of this. Now, there are a host of things that need to be done in this regard, including here at universities in service of systemic transformation. We look forward to seeing what is undertaken in Northern Virginia in the coming period and being in dialogue with you about that. I have to say, I've been working in this area now for a number of decades. And what I see actually is such energy and hope around this agenda for building a democratic economy and promoting community wealth building that I think this makes it the most exciting time to be active in economic thinking and in politics in a generation. So let me stop there and we can have a discussion. Thank you.